Beer Flood, Episode 1, Giant Barrels and Engineering Disasters. Here it is, the first episode of the famously intoxicating event in human history, the London Beer Flood. A story that is at once tragic and so absurd it makes you think, man, I wish I'd been there, but sober. What follows is a completely unserious biography, packed with anachronisms and almost guaranteed to make historians spin in their graves. If you're ready, fasten your seatbelts. Or don't. Everything is about to get sticky anyway. This event took place in London, England, and went down in history as the London Beer Flood, as the foam of the apocalypse rose. Date, Monday, October 17, 1814. Location, that cursed intersection of Tottenham Court Road and Oxford Street, the St. Giles district of London. If right now you're picturing a Bridgerton-style London, dukes in pastel-colored outfits gliding around with porcelain teacups, saying things like, "Ah, what a lovely day, Lord Anthony." Take that image, throw it straight into your mental trash can, and then set the trash can on fire. Because London in 1814 looked far less like a romantic period drama and far more like a gigantic circus built inside a sewer. The city reeked of coal smoke, horse manure, the sweat of unwashed people, and pure despair. In other words, imagine a Victorian-era version of today's Metrobus line. Except deodorant hadn't been invented yet. The St. Giles district was London's infamous rookery, a slum so bad it would probably be blurred out, even on Google Maps. It was a place where Irish immigrants, thieves, beggars, and people thoroughly beaten down by life lived stacked on top of one another, underneath one another, and occasionally inside one another. There was no such thing as social distancing here. If someone sneezed, a guy 3 streets away would say, "Bless you," because the virus would already have arrived. Picture a neighborhood of tightly interlocked houses, and then multiply it by 2. Right in the rotten heart of this nest of misery stood a colossal structure, rising like a monument to capitalism itself. Moo & Co. Brewery. Fermentation as an ego project. Don't let the word brewery fool you. Henry Moo was no ordinary brewer. He was the Elon Musk of the 19th century, except instead of going to Mars, his ambition was to send the people of London into an alcohol-induced coma. At the time, beer producers in London were engaged in what we would today recognize as a Silicon Valley-style pissing contest. Pardon, a fermentation rivalry. Everyone was saying, "Mine is the biggest, yes, the barrel." What did you think we meant? If subjected to Freudian analysis, this obsession would probably reveal deeply traumatic childhood indicators in Henry Moo's psyche. But that is not our topic. Our topic is porter beer. Porter was the latte of its time, dark, thick, nutritious, and probably classified in the same family as motor oil. Londoners didn't like water, because if you drank water, you died of cholera. If you drank beer, your liver failed, but at least you died happy. A simple risk analysis. To crush his rival Whitbread Brewery, Henry Moo had barrels of unimaginable size constructed at his Tottenham Court Road facility. Calling them barrels is almost insulting. They were more like wooden skyscrapers, and especially vat number 1. Ah yes, that beautiful, majestic, ominous number 1. The true herald of disaster. This barrel stood at roughly 7 meters tall and contained a staggering 135,000 gallons of beer, about 610,000 liters. Yes, you heard that correctly. Picture an Olympic swimming pool, fill it to the brim with dark beer, then shove it vertically into a building. That was Moo's vision. If Instagram had existed in 1814, Henry Moo would have been posing in front of that barrel with hashtags like #hustleculture, #grindset, and #bigbarrelenergy. I'd love to swim in it, my friends, but duty calls, and I must keep explaining. These barrels were so enormous that parties were held inside them. I am not joking. When the barrel was completed, 200 people went inside and had dinner. That evening probably marked history's first truly echoey meal. Someone shouting, "Could you pass the salt?" would hear their voice loop around the barrel 3 times before coming back as, "Pass it, pass it, pass it." An engineering marvel. And iron hoops now, put on your engineering hat for a moment, or at least silence that inner voice that, while assembling IKEA furniture, looks at the leftover screws and says, they probably added extras. Must not be important. What do you need to hold 600 tons of liquid inside a wooden barrel? A. Prayer. B. Magic. C. Respect for the laws of physics. D. Iron Hoops Moo and Company. Chose option D, but at the time they trusted option A a bit more. These gigantic wooden tanks were held together by massive iron bands, hoops wrapped around them. Each hoop weighed about 350 kilos. In other words, they were metal giants hugging the barrel and whispering, "For the love of God, don't give up on us." However, there was a small problem: logistics and maintenance. The Moo Brewery was a modern logistics firm's worst nightmare. If a risk analyst walked into that building today, they wouldn't even bother writing a report. They'd recommend setting the place on fire and claiming the insurance money. The barrels were old, the building was old, the floor was old, and most importantly, porter beer released gas during fermentation. Inside the barrel, pressure was constantly building up. This barrel was, in fact, a ticking time bomb. Except instead of a tick-tock sound, it went glug-glug. George Crick, founder of the Nah, It'll Be Fine, Bro school of thought. Now let us turn to the hidden hero of our story, or rather, its anti-hero, George Crick, the warehouse supervisor. George was an Englishman with the laid-back attitude of a stereotypical Middle Eastern shopkeeper. His job was to inspect the barrels, check for leaks, and generally report to the boss that everything was under control. George's life philosophy was probably this: if you ignore it, it's not a problem. That day, around 4:30 p.m., George was carrying out his routine inspections in the warehouse. The weather was that classic London gray. Outside in the houses on New Street, the brewery's back alley, people were struggling through lives of misery. Some were doing laundry, some were trying to put their hungry children to sleep, and others were wondering, will dinner tonight be boiled potatoes or just boiled water? As George walked past the massive barrel number 1, he noticed something on the floor. He probably experienced a minor shock. A gigantic iron hoop weighing 700 pounds, over 300 kilos, was lying there. What would a normal person do if they saw one of the main safety mechanisms of an apartment building-sized liquid tank, namely that enormous metal clamp, fall off on its own and crash to the ground? Scream and run. Call the fire brigade, back then, horse-drawn watermen. Evacuate the building. What did George Crick do? Nothing. Yes, literally nothing. He shrugged, because at the Moo Brewery, this happened 2 or 3 times a week. Oh, come on, George thought. That huge barrel is held together by 22 hoops. One falls off and the whole wooden titan isn't going to collapse, right? It's only 600 tons of pressure. Nothing will happen. We'll deal with it, bro. This attitude was a prime candidate for the all-time list of history's greatest famous last words. If WhatsApp had existed back then, George would probably have sent a message like this. George, guys, the belt on barrel number 1 fell off again, LOL. Boss, is there a problem? George, nah, bro, what problem could there be? It's just standing there. I left a note. Maintenance can look at it later. Yes, George actually wrote a note. Caution, hoop has fallen off. Put it back on when you have time. And he left this note on the table so the repairman would see it when he arrived. Can you believe the level of nonchalance? He was acting as if the office photocopier had run out of toner, while behind him, an alcoholic version of Hiroshima was getting ready to explode. The calm before the storm and the smell of beer. The hours dragged on. Barrel number 1 was struggling to bear its load, letting out wooden creaks and groans. But in London, everything creaked, so no one found this unusual. Just behind the brewery wall, life continued in the basement apartments on New Street. Take Mrs. Ann Saville, for example. The poor woman was mourning her child, who had died the day before. According to Irish tradition, a wake was being held in the house. People were gathered in the cramped basement, praying and sharing their grief together. By a cruel twist of fate, that very basement was about to receive the largest and deadliest beer service in human history. For these people, beer was an unreachable luxury. They lived surrounded by the thick, yeasty smell, drifting from the brewery chimneys. Yet to drink that beer would have cost them half a week's wages. This was the greatest joke of Victorian capitalism. Live right next to the means of production, but settle for merely smelling the product. Brutal. Absolutely brutal. But barrel number one seemed to have decided to deliver social justice. Even if in a slightly aggressive manner, it was about to put the slogan, "Free beer for everyone," into action. The breaking point had arrived around 5:30 p.m. George Crick was sitting in his office, skimming through newspapers, probably also thinking about what he would have for dinner. Inside barrel number one, billions of yeast cells were throwing their final party, producing carbon dioxide. The pressure was rising. The wooden planks were starting to mutter. "That's it for us, mate. Union hours are over, and we didn't even get paid overtime." The remaining iron hoops were straining. We don't know if that thin, high-pitched metallic ring was heard, but if Netflix ever made a documentary about this event, it would definitely be called Dark Brew, The London Flood. This would be the moment when tense violin music kicked in, accompanied by a slow-motion shot of a trembling bolt. George's "nothing will happen, bro" attitude had stepped into a boxing ring with the laws of physics, and physics was about to knock George out in the very first round. That single fallen hoop was, in fact, the first domino. The belly of the barrel began to swell like a pregnant whale. Wooden fibers split apart. Centuries-old oak trees could no longer contain the liquid monster trapped inside them. And then, that sound. Cannon fire? No. Thunder? No. This was the wet, savage, terrifying roar of 600,000 liters of liquid breaking free. Barrel number one exploded, but it didn't stop there. The shock wave of the blast toppled the neighboring barrels like dominoes. In an instant, the Moo Brewery warehouse became the birthplace of a black, foamy, sticky, lukewarm tsunami. Over 1.5 million liters, more than 300,000 gallons of beer. The explosions rippled outward in waves. George Crick? We don't know what went through his mind at that exact moment, but he may have thought, "I should have run instead of writing that note." Or perhaps he simply let loose with a truly monumental curse. The walls shook. The bricks cracked. The 7-meter-high brick wall of the Moo Brewery could not withstand this liquid sledgehammer from within. It tore apart as if made of paper and burst outward toward the streets of London. Now stop and imagine this. You're walking down the street. It's cold. You're hungry. And suddenly, from around the corner, you see a dark brown wave, 4 to 5 meters high, rushing toward you, carrying massive chunks of wood and brewery equipment on its surface. Would you start looking for an inflatable raft? This is not a flood of water. This is a flood of porter. The smell burns your nostrils. Its density is greater than water, so the impact hits like a truck. What did people feel in that moment? Fear? Yes. Shock? Absolutely. But I'm certain some of them also thought, are we lucky or are we dying? And if I'm going to die, should I open my mouth? This was the beginning of history's most absurd disaster. The streets turned into rivers, but not with fish. Instead, drunk rats and drifting furniture floated by. Victorian London was about to face a happy hour it never asked for, and nobody had a reservation. The revenge of barrel number one had begun, and that small hoop George said would be fine had now triggered a wave powerful enough to wipe an entire neighborhood off the map. To be continued if we don't drown in beer foam.
Episode 2, The Beer Tsunami, The Porter Raid. Here we continue with Episode 2 of the London Beer Flood biography, the moment when fermentation went rogue and physics decided to take a vacation. Fasten your seatbelts, or better yet, place yourself in our capable hands. The moment of the explosion. Date: Monday, October 17th, 1814. Location: the Horseshoe Brewery, Tottenham Court Road. Weather: gloomy, gray, and about to become extremely sticky. Mondays are generally dull. This is universal and timeless. Whether you were a Sumerian tablet scribe in 3000 BC, sure, work was tough, but still, or a white-collar employee in 2026. But Monday, October 17th, 1814, was the absolute nirvana of Mondays. That day, for the poor residents of London's St. Giles district, the phrase starting the week badly would come to mean a 3-story building high wave of beer is coming straight at me. I probably don't need to remind you to look on the bright side. Our scene of the crime was the Horseshoe Brewery, owned by Maux and Company. This place was one of the Industrial Revolution's greatest displays of industrial bravado. Why? Because at the time there was a bizarre contest among brewers, a literal arms race. Who could build the biggest barrel? The Maux family set modesty aside and installed right in the middle of the factory a colossal wooden tank rising like a pagan temple. This tank, my friends, was nothing like that wobbly bookshelf you bought from IKEA. This thing stood 6.7 meters tall. Imagine stacking 2 giraffes on top of each other. It helps. And with its thousands of gallons of capacity, seemed to be screaming, "I am a disaster, and I am coming." Inside it, a full 1.5 million liters of porter beer were fermenting. Porter was the working class's Red Bull of the era. Dark, nourishing, and judging by today's health standards, probably containing half the periodic table. It was around 4:30 p.m. In the modern world, this is the sweet spot when office workers start thinking, should I leave this email for tomorrow? And blood sugar levels begin to dip. George Crick, the man responsible for the brewery's warehouse, and very likely about to witness the greatest logistical failure of his life, was walking around the massive tank. And then that sound was heard. Crack! This was the sound of a 700-kilogram iron hoop resigning from duty, essentially saying, "I can't take this pressure anymore. I'm reporting you to the union." One of the 29 iron hoops holding the tank together gave in to gravity and pressure and crashed to the floor. What would a normal person do upon seeing a 700-kilogram piece of iron shoot off a massive pressure vessel? A. Scream and run. B. Call the police, the fire brigade, and possibly their mother. C. We'll deal with it, no problem, and carry on working. George Crick, with full 19th century British composure, or perhaps stupidity, chose option C. He informed his superiors, who responded in a classic, "We'll look at it later, it's tea time now" fashion, and wrote a note. Think of it like a message in a WhatsApp group saying, "Servers might be on fire," followed by a calm "scene." No one realized that this single hoop was in fact the doorknob to the apocalypse. Or perhaps it was just that timeless belief, nothing will happen to us. At around 5:30 p.m., the laws of physics finally said, "I can't take this anymore." The remaining hoops followed suit, essentially declaring, "Our brother is gone and we're going with him. Revolution time!" and exploded simultaneously with a thunderous roar. Words fall short when trying to describe this explosion, but let's try anyway. Imagine a Michael Bay movie on Netflix with an unlimited budget. Now, remove the fire from the explosions and replace it entirely with alcohol. The colossal barrel detonated under its internal pressure. But the real problem wasn't just this single barrel exploding. The shock wave toppled the neighboring barrels like dominoes. In an instant, inside the factory building, a tsunami formed, one so massive it would be rare even in the middle of the ocean. But this was not water. This was a dark, dense, sticky, lukewarm 5% alcohol death. Let the horse die from barley, as the saying goes. The beer wave was so powerful that it tore down the factory's 7-meter-high brick wall as if it were a paper model. Bricks flew through the air like shrapnel. In that moment, the Horseshoe Brewery ceased to be a factory. It became a volcano, spewing porter instead of lava. Welcome to St. Giles, capital of misery and now of beer. Directly behind the factory lay the St. Giles district. This was the part of Victorian London people described as Don't go in there, they'll steal your kidneys. These slum areas, known as rookeries, were places where people lived stacked on top of one another, crushed by poverty. There was no sewage system, hygiene was a myth, and most residents didn't live past the age of 30. And now, on top of all that misery, 1.5 million liters of beer were coming their way. Picture the wave, a 4 to 5 meter high wall of black, foamy liquid. As it surged into New Street, the cats, dogs, and rats probably didn't even have time to think, evolution did not prepare us for this, before being swept away. The first victims were the houses closest to the factory. 2 homes were ripped from their foundations and collapsed like biscuits dunked into milk, except the milk was beer and the biscuits were brick buildings full of people. Luck or curse, either way, pure tragedy. At this point, one of the greatest psychological dilemmas in human history unfolded. Put yourself in the place of an Irish immigrant on that street. You've spent your entire life without access to clean water. The only things you can drink are expensive beer or cheap gin. And suddenly, not from the sky, but from the end of the street, tons of free beer are rushing toward you. Dear God, should I have wished for something else? Your brain splits in two. Survival instinct. Run, now, you're going to drown. This is a tsunami. Opportunist instinct. Grab the pots and pans, free booze. God finally answered our prayers, though maybe he overdid it a bit. For those caught in the street, the situation was utter chaos. The wave was so powerful it swept people, carts, and street stalls along with it. People were struggling to breathe, while simultaneously trying not to swallow the porter flooding into their mouths, or secretly swallowing it. The Taverstagham's pub experienced irony at its absolute peak. A pub being destroyed by beer from the outside was the universe's way of saying, "Look how dark my sense of humor is." The pub's bartender, Eleanor Cooper, was trapped under the collapsing wall. The poor woman probably never imagined that she might die crushed beneath the very thing she had spent her life serving. It was as tragic as a firefighter dying in a fire, and just as absurd. As the floodwaters began pouring into the basement apartments, things grew even stranger. At the time, most poor families lived in basements. In an instant, their homes filled with beer all the way up to the ceiling. People climbed onto their furniture, children floated in their cradles, submerged in beer. But the real spectacle unfolded out in the street. Once the initial shock of the wave passed and the beer level dropped to waist height, the people of St. Giles finally grasped what was happening. Is this beer? Yes, and the good stuff. And at that moment, rescue operations quietly turned into a harvest festival. Those whose homes hadn't collapsed grabbed whatever they could and rushed into the street. Pots, pans, buckets, cracked vases, even ats. Some people bent down and tried to drink straight from the ground. There are rumors of a man who took off his shoe, filled it with beer, drank it, and declared, "A bit sandy, but the flavor's spot on." All right, I made that part up, but there's a 99% chance something like it actually happened in that chaos. The streets had become the largest, dirtiest, and most dangerous open-air bar in the world. However, this festive mood didn't last long, because beer, especially in quantities like this, is not just a fun liquid. It's sticky, it stinks, and mixed into it were the dust of collapsed buildings, the filth of the streets, a reminder there was no sewage system at the time, and tragically, the bodies of the victims washed and dissolved into the beer itself. The thin line between tragedy and absurdity. The most Black Mirror-like chapter of this disaster was a wake being held in a house. An Irish family had gathered in a basement to mourn a child who had died the day before. According to tradition, they were drinking, crying, and praying together. By a cruel twist of fate, when the beer flood smashed through the windows and walls and filled the room, 5 more people, already grieving a dead child, drowned to death. this was pure tragedy. It was the kind of scene that even screenwriters would cut, saying, "Come on, this is too much. The audience won't believe it." But real life is more ruthless than the worst writer. When the rescue teams arrived, rescue team at the time meaning a few volunteers with lanterns and guards who had no idea what they were doing, the scene looked like this: collapsed houses, people dripping with sticky brown liquid, a thick stench of yeast and death hanging in the air. From beneath the rubble, cries of "Help!" echoed, while others lay passed out, enjoying the cheapest and fastest drunkenness of their lives. Some had drunk so much that the only thing separating them from a corpse was the rise and fall of their chest. Someone shouted from the ruins, "I can't feel my leg!" Another voice replied, "I can't feel my tongue either, but for a different reason." You get the idea. A surreal tableau in the heart of London. People trying to surf a beer ocean, swimming to avoid drowning, and at the same time attempting to stockpile booze. As the night wore on and the waters, the beers, began to recede, what remained was a complete logistical and humanitarian disaster. St. Giles had turned into a giant bar mop. It would take months for the smell to leave London. People were wringing beer out of their clothes, trying to wipe foam from their hair. There were dead, there were injured, and there were thousands of people who couldn't quite process what had just happened, staring at one another and asking, "What did we just live through?" This was a 1.5 million liter monument to irresponsibility. It was an industrial accident, but also one of the strangest social experiments in modern history. If you drown a neighborhood in beer, do people mourn or do they party? The answer, both, but in a deeply confusing order. When the sun rose the next morning, London was hung over. But this time, the headache wasn't from drinking. It came from the stench and the destruction. And of course, the real comedy or tragedy was about to begin in the courtrooms. Because back then, words like workplace safety or compensation hadn't been invented yet. But that is a story for the next episode. For now, let us observe a moment of silence for the exact moment when George Crick looked at that fallen hoop and thought, "I really should have called in sick today." And the next time your beer foams over, don't get angry. At least your house is still standing. The trailer for what comes next goes something like this: courtroom proceedings, a jury swayed by the defense of an act of God, beers drunk, yes, again, in honor of the dead, and the unbelievable story of how the brewery walked away from all this clean as a whistle and even received a tax refund afterward. I am not joking. To be continued if we can endure the smell and don't get stuck to the floor. Happiness delivered in cooking pots. An excellent choice. We are diving straight into the very heart of history's wettest, stickiest, and quite possibly highest proof disaster, the chaotic happy hours just before the next morning. Happy Hour Hell and the Free Vinegar Festival. Or, those who brought a cup survived, those who didn't tried to swim. If you were the director of a disaster movie, say Michael Bay, but a Michael Bay who cares less about explosions and more about fluid dynamics, you would stage the scene like this. First, a thunderous roar, then collapsing brick walls, and finally, a brown tsunami crashing down upon St. Giles, London's most miserable neighborhood. But there is one thing Hollywood always leaves out: the smell. My friends, when 1.5 million liters of fermented barley water, sewer runoff, coal smoke, and 19th century British hygiene standards, which were essentially based on the principle of don't wash it, just air it out, combine, the result is not Chanel No. 5. This smell doesn't just assault your nostrils, it imprints itself on your DNA and makes your grandchildren's noses ache in advance. That's how powerful it was. And yet, for the residents of St. Giles, this smell meant only one thing: opportunity. The first question asked during the shock phase. So, what is this wet stuff? When the first wave, quite literally a full-scale tsunami, tore through the buildings, there was a brief moment of silence. The kind of silence equivalent to those 10 seconds of modern terror when you stare at your modem thinking, did Wi-Fi just die? People lifted their heads from the rubble, wiped the sticky liquid off their faces, and asked the ancient question, is this blood? Sewage? Or has God finally answered our prayers and decided to make wine rain from the heavens? The answer arrived in the form of a pig, floating on its back in the middle of the street, squealing with delight. This was the proud product of Mewks's Brewery, high-alcohol, thick-bodied porter beer. In a normal society, let's say Switzerland, when a tsunami hits, what do people do? They run to higher ground, call the authorities, and check their insurance policies. The champions of Victorian London's Poverty League, however, conducted a very different kind of risk assessment. The primitive algorithm in their brains ran like this. Is my house destroyed? Yes. Am I soaked? Yes. Does the thing soaking me get you drunk? Yes. Conclusion. Quick, bring the pots. That dark Monday, the year was 1814, marked the beginning of something truly historic. At that moment, the largest, most chaotic, and wettest open buffet the world had ever seen began. If you look down on modern humans trampling one another for a discounted air fryer on Black Friday, then you clearly haven't seen the streets of St. Giles. There, people weren't crushing each other for appliances, but to drink beer dripping from the ground, the pavement, sentient from each other's coats. The neighborhood instantly turned into a massive, uncontrolled, and profoundly unhygienic party. Picture the excitement of social media influencers filming unboxing videos. Now replace them with a toothless dock worker taking off his shoe and chugging the beer that had pooled inside it. Yes, that was the scene. The streets became a showcase of pure logistical improvisation. Anyone who could grabbed their household crockery and ran outside. Those without hats used their hats. Those without hats used their hands. And those whose hands were already full, and I swear I am not making this up, started licking the paving stones directly. On one side stood Mrs. Higgins, her house walls collapsed, crying, "Everything I owned is gone!" On the other side was her neighbor, Mr. O'Malley, dunking his head into the beer puddle that had formed in Mrs. Higgins' destroyed kitchen, having the best day of his life. Never before had tragedy and comedy stood so close together, and never before had they been so drunk. Oscar Awards shortlist nominees. Amid this chaos, countless micro-stories unfolded, each one showcasing the magnificent stupidity of human nature. According to reports coming straight from the scene of the incident, which, to be precise, was the scene itself, the river of beer, the situation was as follows. Case 1. Gourmet drowning. According to eyewitness accounts, who were reportedly drunk themselves at the time, a man swept along by the current was clinging desperately to a piece of a broken barrel, while simultaneously refusing to spit out the beer flooding into his mouth. On the contrary, he was savoring it. I am willing to swear that even as he was drowning, he briefly thought, "Have I had a bit too much?" The man was trying to swim and swallow at the same time, determined not to waste this free bounty. This was the biological version of the sunk cost fallacy. I'm dying, but at least I'll go out pleasantly buzzed. Case 2. Happy hour under the rubble. Two people trapped in the basement of a collapsed house triggered the mobilization of rescue teams, by which we mean other drunk locals arriving with pickaxes, ostensibly to help, but mostly to look for beer. However, the sounds coming from beneath the rubble were not cries of help, but drunken sea shanty sung in chorus. The men were trapped in their basement, now flooded with beer from the brewery, and they were in no particular hurry to be rescued. When the would-be rescuers shouted, "Is anyone in there?" the response was probably something like, "Yes, but the barrel isn't finished yet. How about coming back in half an hour?" Case 3, the shoe shine artist. A shoe shiner named Timothy decided that the most practical containers for collecting beer were his own boots. He took them off, filled them, drank, then filled them again. The problem was that those boots were coated in London street mud, horse manure, and coal dust. To Timothy, this merely added an earthy, full-bodied note to the beer. Modern craft brewers today spend months trying to create things like bacon-flavored stout. Timothy achieved the same effect in 1814, entirely organically with the help of a single boot. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what you call visionary thinking. Hospitals, a medical miracle or just drunkenness? In the hours following the disaster, Middlesex Hospital experienced the strangest shift in its history. The profile of patients brought in, let me remind you, there was no such thing as an emergency room back then, just the room with blood-stained butchers wearing aprons, was something medicine had never encountered before. Doctors thought they had seen everything: broken legs, signs of plague, stab wounds. But this time was different. Patients lay on stretchers giggling, flirting with nurses, and requiring no anesthesia during procedures because they were already drunk to the point of coma. I can easily imagine the chief physician retreating to his office and writing the following in his notebook. Patient, Mr. Smith. Complaint, crushed rib cage and excessive joy. Diagnosis, a brick wall fell on him, but his blood alcohol level is so high that instead of feeling pain, he has formed an emotional bond with the wall. Treatment, give him plenty of water when he wakes up and avoid sudden movements. If he vomits, the entire ward will smell for days. In some cases, patients delivered to the hospital as dead turned out to be merely passed out, which caused minor crises in the morgue as well. One of the corpses waking up on the autopsy table and shouting, "One more round," was not recorded as a miraculous resurrection in the medical understanding of the era, but rather as, "Damn it, drunk again." Nurses and doctors stood there, staring at one another, utterly unsure of what they were supposed to do next. A philosophical dilemma. Are we lucky or are we dying? The greatest damage caused by the London beer flood was not to buildings, but to people's perception of reality. The residents of St. Giles were poor, so poor that even their dreams were secondhand. And now, the most expensive and luxurious thing they would ever see in their lives, beer, had flowed straight into their homes. This triggered a profound existential crisis, followed inevitably by liver failure. On one hand, their houses had collapsed, relatives had been swept away by the flood, their belongings were ruined. On the other hand, unlimited and free beer. A group of locals gathered at a street corner, standing knee-deep in beer, holding chipped cups, trying to assess the situation. It resembled a modern corporate crisis management meeting, except instead of a PowerPoint presentation, there were drunk, disoriented people who had no idea what they were doing. "Look," said one of them, "I lost my house. My wife left me. She was already lost. I think the current carried her into the Thames. But look on the bright side. That foam on this beer, wow, it really got to me." Another nodded. "The Lord gave, the Lord took away. But first, he gave. I say we're still in profit." These people struggling in the beer flood were actually trapped between a scarcity mindset and sudden wealth syndrome. You know those Netflix documentaries about lottery winners whose lives fall apart? This was the 19th century version, except instead of money, it was liquid bread, and everything happened within a very short window of about 15 minutes. The helplessness of authority and the "please don't drink" warnings. The guards and constables who arrived at the scene faced a problem far greater than crowd control: jealousy. It is not hard to imagine a police officer shouting at a woman carrying a bucket of beer, Stop! That belongs to the state. I mean, the brewery. I mean, it's hazardous waste. While secretly thinking, if my shift ended right now, I'd grab a bucket and do the same. As the authorities tried to push people back for safety reasons, the public interpreted this as, they want the free beer for themselves. When will we ever find this again? This misunderstanding only escalated the chaos. At one point, officials attempted to stop people from drinking the beer off the ground by spreading rumors like, this beer is cursed, or it contains rat poison. But you clearly don't know Londoners. For them, free beer with rat poison was still preferable to no beer at all. The risk-reward calculation was made, and drinking continued. After all, they already lived in houses full of rats. Conclusion: a wet silence and a massive headache. As the night wore on and the beer foam began to recede, or rather to be absorbed, St. Giles turned into a vast, sticky, snoring heap. The streets grew quiet. Only the occasional hiccup and the clatter of loose stones falling from damaged buildings broke the silence. Hospitals were full. Morgues were confused. And the survivors, when they woke the next morning, would experience the largest, most collective, and most well-earned hangover in world history. The headache was so intense it could probably have been recorded by seismographs. But this was not merely a physical headache. It was also the beginning of a legal one. Because once the beer dried and sobriety returned, a single question would echo through everyone's mind. Who is going to pay for this? The streets were ruined. People were injured. Homes and businesses lay in wreckage. And believe me, while preparing their act of God defense, the lawyers of the Mukes Brewery would become so desperate that they would seriously debate whether God himself had a fondness for beer. But that is a matter for the next episode, one involving courtrooms, wig-wearing judges, and the infamous work of God argument. For now, let us leave the residents of St. Giles slumped in their sticky streets, their stomachs filled with liters of porter, and their heads filled with thousands of questions. Good night, London, and please, next time, check the valve. To be continued. Episode 4. God's Lawyers and the Bill for Free Beer.
Dear viewers, as beer victims, the events we've witnessed clearly showed us one thing. Free beer is sweeter than honey. But look, this isn't really about beer. The real issue is this. Humanity has repeatedly pretended to learn from history, only to repeat the same mistake, this time with a barrel one size bigger. Some people lost their homes, some lost their walls, and some lost their lives. But the company, it got free advertising, and history took notes. So what did we do? We told the story. We laughed. We thought about it for a moment. Then we said, I'm glad I wasn't there. If this story made you laugh and also made you say, wow, seriously? The like button is right there. Calm, quiet, ready to be pressed. Because learning from history is free, but liking this video doesn't cost a single barrel.
Episode 4. An Act of God and a Tax Refund. Excellent. Fasten your seatbelts, pinch your nose, seriously, the smell does not go away, and bring a lawyer with you, preferably Saul Goodman or Harvey Specter from Suits, because to survive the Victorian justice system, you are going to need a very solid attorney. We continue with the next episode. Surely God must have known what he was doing. If you're going to do something, do it big. The state might even give you a tax refund. Yes, dear lovers of chaos and historical disaster tourists, in the previous episode, we watched London's poorest district transform into an adult-only, R-rated, zero-hygiene version of Willy Wonka, a massive river of beer. People swam, people drowned, pigs got drunk, and London's pavements acquired that distinctive old stale bar carpet smell that would refuse to leave for the next 50 years. Breathe it in. Imagine it. But the real show starts now, because whenever a disaster strikes, two of humanity's most reliable instincts immediately kick in.
Who's going to pay for this? And it wasn't our fault. Unknown forces did it. And welcome to the stage where those instincts collide. This is a courtroom, and believe me, compared to the legal absurdity about to unfold here, Netflix's Making a Murderer looks like an elementary school play.
Justice is blind, and its nose is permanently blocked. A few days after the incident, once things had dried a little, though the stickiness was still at the level of burst septic tank, the investigation began. Now, let's imagine what would happen if this occurred in the modern world. X, would collapse. It would trend instantly. The CEO of Mew Brewery would release a tearful apology video, black and white filter, of course. The Ministry of Environment and Urbanization would hand out fines worth millions. Stock prices would crash. Newspapers would run absolutely unhinged headlines. But the year is 1814. We are deep in the Industrial Revolution's workplace safety. What is that? Is it edible phase? Be patient. This is just getting started. When the investigation committee arrived at the site, they were probably walking with their shoes sticking to the ground at every step. The bodies of the 8 victims, the number varies by source because population records at the time followed a roughly some people live around here logic, had already been removed. What remained were collapsed walls and a legal process that should be taught in law schools as How to Get Away with It 101. Because the lawyers of the Mew Company stood before the jury and delivered one of the most absurd defenses in history. The defense strategy was exactly this. Your Honor, esteemed members of the jury, yes, 610,000 liters of beer spilled into the streets. Yes, houses were destroyed. Yes, people died. But I ask you this, was it our fault that the iron hoop holding the vat broke? No, this was entirely God's decision. He wanted it to happen. Let's pause for a moment. An act of God? So according to the defense, God was sitting on a cloud that day looking down and saying, "You know what? I don't like that vat on Tottenham Court Road. And frankly, I think the people of St. Giles are a bit too dry. Let's snap that 29-ton hoop and get this party started." Pure generosity. A divine beer delivery for the poor. This is the highest possible level of blaming theology for a logistics failure. Imagine calling a shipping company about a lost package and being told, "Sir, your parcel was lost due to God being very busy today. Shame, really. Looks like you won't be playing PlayStation this fate." That was the courtroom's exact vibe. And now, brace yourself. The jury bought it. They ruled that no one was at fault. The disaster was officially classified as accidental and unavoidable, an act of God. And do you know what that means? No compensation, no fines, no prison, no seizure of the Mew family's assets. Just a collective shrug and a polite, "Terrible misfortune. Now please disperse, gentlemen. The floor is still sicky." The victims' families, already among the poorest, most crushed people in London, the kind even Oliver Twist would refuse to live with, were left with absolutely nothing. Well, nothing except soggy furniture and trauma. Victorian justice in a nutshell. A magnificent system that blamed the mistakes of the rich on God and the mistakes of the poor on immorality. Sorry, friends, that era was a bit grim.
Funeral rituals. Let's step out of the courtroom and return to the narrow streets of St. Giles, because things become even stranger there. Most of the victims were Irish immigrants, and in Irish culture, there is a tradition known as the Irish Wake, a vigil held in the home of the deceased before the funeral. A wake is a gathering where family and neighbors come together, combining mourning with social connection. Rather than being a silent, sealed-off form of grief, it is based on accepting death as a natural part of life. Core characteristics. 1. Keeping the deceased at home. The deceased is typically kept in their own home, often in an open coffin. The purpose is to allow loved ones to say goodbye one last time and to accept death rather than deny it. 2. Visits and community. Neighbors, relatives, and even distant acquaintances come to the house. The focus is not only on condolences, but on communal solidarity. The house may become crowded, and this is considered completely normal. 3. Food, drink, and conversation. Tea, cake, and bread are common. Traditionally, whiskey is also present. People talk and share memories. Laughter is considered not disrespectful. On the contrary, it is seen as a way of celebrating the life of the deceased. 4. Humor and storytelling. Funny, strange, or unforgettable stories about the deceased are told. In this sense, the Irish wake is one of the clearest examples of the balance between mourning and humor. This is not viewed as disrespecting the dead, but as honoring them as a human being. Religious dimension. Catholic prayers are recited, especially the Rosary. However, the ritual is not purely religious, it is deeply cultural. Even in modern Ireland, where the religious aspect has diminished, the wake tradition continues. Cultural significance. Not fearing death, not grieving alone, healing as a community, keeping life at the center even at the moment of death. For this reason, the Irish wake may appear strange to outsiders, but within Irish culture, it is considered profoundly respectful and humane. Today, in cities, wakes tend to be shorter and more modest. In rural areas, the traditional form remains strong. Although modern funeral homes have become more common, the idea of saying goodbye at home has not disappeared.
Now let's turn the irony up a notch. Are you ready? What did these people die from? Beer. What was served to people at the funeral? Beer. According to some rumors, the beer that was handed out was actually beer salvaged from the flood. This is like playing Chopin at a memorial for someone who was crushed by a falling piano, or throwing an ice water party to honor the victims of the Titanic. Absurd? Absolutely. But for the residents of St. Giles at the time, this wasn't absurd at all. It was a survival mechanism. Free beer's free beer. Whether it falls from the sky or floods your basement, what's the difference? Some historians, and gossip columns like ours, claim that people displayed the bodies in mourning houses and tried to cover funeral expenses by charging an entry fee to visitors. Things allegedly spiraled so far out of control that, due to the sheer crowd inside one funeral home, the floor collapsed and people fell into the level below. Surviving a beer flood only to get injured when the floor collapses at a funeral. That's basically the 1800s version of Final Destination. Whoever wrote that script clearly hated the characters. Now imagine this. You have a WhatsApp group called Hannah's Funeral and After Party. Admin. Guys, we lost Hannah. She drowned in the beer flood. Member 1. That's terrible. Should I react with a sad emoji? Also, when is the service? Admin. Tomorrow evening. By the way, we're bringing the porters we collected from the cellar. No point wasting them. Member 2. Dude, are we sure? She literally died because of porter. Admin. Stop being emotional. We need to drink it before the yeast goes bad. These people weren't processing trauma the way modern psychologists would recommend, by talking about it. They were processing it by drinking it. And let's be honest, given the level of poverty they lived in, they didn't really have many other options. The triumph of capitalism, the Mew Company, and a miracle of the tax refund. If everything you've heard so far has made you angry, take a deep breath or grab an ice-cold beer from the fridge and keep listening, because what comes next will send your rage levels straight into the stratosphere. After the court closed the case with a neat little "God did it," the Mewks Brewery still had a major problem on its hands. No, not guilt. Companies don't have consciences, they have balance sheets. The problem was taxes. Specifically, the taxes they had already paid on the beer that had spilled. At the time, British brewers paid an excise duty to the state for every unit of beer they produced.
Mukes had already paid this tax in advance for the enormous barrel that exploded and for the thousands of liters in the neighboring barrels that followed it into the streets. Henry Mukes, the owner of the company, went straight to Parliament and submitted what may be one of the most shameless, brazen, and audacious petitions in history. In essence, Mukes said this: "Honorable members of the state, as you know, due to an act of God, our brewery exploded. A neighborhood was destroyed, people died, etc., etc. Let's skip those details. The real issue is this: we couldn't sell that beer. It never reached the consumer. People didn't drink it. I mean, technically they did, but they swallowed it while drowning, and that doesn't count. Therefore, we cannot be expected to pay taxes on beer we did not sell. We would like our tax money back." And what did Parliament do? Did they say, "Get out of here, people died"? Did they shout, "You shameless man"? Of course not. Parliament said, "Yes, that actually makes sense." To prevent the Mukes Brewery from going bankrupt, because the concept of too big to fail already existed back then, and to protect the industry, the British Parliament agreed to refund the tax on the spilled beer. The company received approximately £7,250 at the time, worth hundreds of thousands of pounds today, either as a direct refund or as a credit against future taxes. That money saved the company from collapse. The factory was repaired, production continued.
The Moe Brewery continued operating until 1922 and survived as a brand until 1961. So the scoreboard looks like this: the poor of St. Giles, 8 dead, destroyed homes, lifelong trauma, sticky floors. Gains? 0. The Moe Company, free publicity, legal exoneration, and on top of that, a tax refund. Winner? Obvious. This is the moral equivalent of an oil tanker spilling crude into the sea, killing thousands of fish, then the company going to the government and saying, "Well, we couldn't sell that oil. Please refund the value of the oil that leaked into the ocean." And the state replying, "Of course, sir. Here's your check." Conclusion: a sticky legacy. The London beer flood is often remembered as a funny anecdote in the dusty margins of history. "Ha ha ha, people drowned in beer, what a way to go," they say. But in reality, this event is one of the most brutal proofs of corporate greed, lack of oversight, and the cheapness of poor people's lives. In court, they claimed the barrel explosion was unavoidable. In truth, all they had to do was routinely inspect the iron hoops and avoid filling the vats to the absolute brim. But more beer meant more money, and if a few Irish immigrants were crushed along the way, well, wasn't it easier to call it God's will? Today, the Dominion Theatre stands in that very area around Tottenham Court Road. Every day, thousands of people walk over streets where 1.5 million liters of beer once surged, where people screamed for help while malt filled their mouths. Maybe that faint stickiness under a beer glass at the theater bar isn't just from a spilled drink. Maybe it's a ghostly residue left over from 1814. What do you think? Did we learn our lesson? Probably not. Today, companies say, "There was a data breach, sorry," and we reply, "Okay, but should I change my password?" The only difference is that 29-ton iron hoops no longer fall on our heads, usually. The London beer flood was one of humanity's greatest oops moments, and if one day you find yourself in London and catch a faint whiff of stale, yeasty air, just sniff, keep walking, and move on. One does not interfere with the work of God. The end. Or merely an intermission until the next barrel explodes. Until our next journey, farewell and stay well.